certain boundaries that we wanted to transcend. We wanted that participants from Punjab University who usually read in Urdu, they should also listen to some talks on books which are written in English. And of course, those who usually read English, they should also listen to the content which is available in Urdu language. For instance, today we have many students from Punjab University's English department, so they listen to this excellent book of Shahid Malik sahab. So that is the idea. And apart from that, there are many other boundaries that we desire to transgress. So with this, I begin with this introduction, and it has indeed been a very, I wouldn't say that it was a daunting read for me. I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book, but of course it is set in the terminology of economics. The book has been dubbed one of the most important books of this century. It is written by Shoshana Zuboff, who is a professor at Harvard University. She teaches at Harvard Business School, and one reviewer called her the Karl Marx of our age. And when I read this book, it was published in December of 2019, and since then the book has received rave reviews all over the world. And why is it such an important book? I think by the end of this talk, all of you will be able to know why it is such an important work. And of course, you will be able to share your comments as well. And especially, I would also welcome students from Information Management Department, because the book is really very relevant to them, especially because it is set in the context of what is now also called information capitalism. And I'm glad that Professor Dr. Muhammad spared his time and he came here to join our session. Now with this, first of all, a bit about the structure of the book. First of all, there is an introduction to the book, and one, I think, prominent quality of this book is that it is really very literary. A lot of qualities are combined in this book, and when you read the prose, I think that you will also derive the pleasure that we usually derive when we read a literary work. And I will also be sharing a few samples with you here. So the very first chapter or the very first section of the book is introduction, and a title is also given to it, and the title is Home or Exile in Digital Future. So Shoshana Zuboff uses the metaphor of a home, and she says, of course, she defines what a home is, and the question that she raises at the very beginning is whether or she questions whether we want to have the future as a home where we feel comfortable, where we feel secure, or do we want to live in a house which is made of glass walls, that whatever we do, everything is being observed. So she begins with this sort of, I would say, a metaphor of a home. She begins with that, she ends with that, and throughout the book she refers to this metaphor of a home. And she keeps talking about it. She keeps coming back to this metaphor, as I will explain in a while. So after this introduction, she has organized the book in 3 sections, so 3 parts. The first part is called The Foundations of Surveillance Capitalism. Now, in introduction, as I will explain to you in a while, this is just a preview of my talk and also an overview of the book. The second part is called The Advance of Surveillance Capitalism. So there is this kind of chronologic of the book, that she begins with the foundations of surveillance capitalism and how it advanced. And then the third part, which is the last part of the book, it is called Instrumentarian Power for a Third Modernity. Now, she uses a lot of new words which she has coined herself, and that's why in the introduction she specifies that whenever you are engaging with a new phenomena, you have to come up with new coinage. You have to come up with new words. Had Dr. Nasir Abbas Nayyar would have been here, had he been here, I would have cited his unease when in the domain of Urdu literature, various critics point out and they express their reservation that why is it that literary theorists use new terminology. Now, new terminology is essential because when you engage with new phenomena, you have to come up with newer expressions. So one such term is instrumentarian power, which I will explain in a short while. So this is the overall structure, and it ends with a conclusion chapter which is entitled A Coup from Above. So with this, let's move on to the first part and see what is discussed in the first part. Now, in this very part, as I mentioned earlier, it is entitled Home or Exile in the Digital Future. What she highlights is that as far as surveillance capitalism is concerned, she has given 8 definitions of surveillance capitalism. At the very beginning, at the very first chapter, on the very first chapter, she has given these 8 definitions of what surveillance capitalism is. And I've extracted a few phrases from all those definitions for the sake of course, brevity. And these are a few expressions which are of importance and which should be enough to give you a kind of a shock therapy as far as the nature of surveillance capitalism is concerned. The word surveillance also means nigarani, that we are being watched, and how that information or that data which is gathered as we use our devices, as we use our phones, as we of course create this data, which is, I will be talking about it, which is called behavioral surplus. Now those of you who are familiar with economics, you know that as far as capital is concerned, capital is the surplus value which is reinvested to create more wealth. So she talks about that behavioral surplus. So at the very beginning she says that it is a new economic order that claims human experience as free raw material. So right now, this video which is being projected to screens all over Pakistan, including my home, where I guess my father is also sitting and watching, listening to this talk. So this data is also being not only monitored, but it also being accumulated, and this is also a surplus which then later on is used for the creation of capital. So our experience now is the raw material. Now when we talk about colonialism, we talk about this raw material that was gathered from countries like India, and then that raw material was taken back to the industries of Europe and of England, and then that raw material was transformed into a finished product, and that finished product was then sold back in the local markets in India. And that's how this country was also economically colonized, and of course we were stripped of the prosperity that we earlier had. Another phrase that she uses, a parasitic economic logic. Now this is a parasite on our experiences. So the parasitic economic logic. Look at the tenor of this expression. A rogue mutation of capitalism. A rogue mutation. That is another expression which he uses for it. As significant a threat to human nature as industrial capitalism was a threat to nature. So we know, we are familiar with this phenomena now, what we call climate catastrophe, and of course the damage that has been done to the environment, and global warming due to mass consumption and also mass production. Now she says that now the raw material is what we do all the time, and an overthrow of the people's sovereignty. So people no longer have a sovereignty, they cannot decide what should be done. It is these owners of these companies who decide. Even law is unable to resist their trespassing into domains which were earlier considered sacred. So she goes on to talk about that, and one clarification is very important, that surveillance capitalism does not automatically mean technology. Surveillance capitalism is not equal to technology, it's not that. Rather, it is a logic that imbues technology and commands it into action. So it is something which makes use of technology. It is not technology in itself, it makes use of technology. So surveillance capitalism employs many technologies, but it cannot be equated with any one technology. So it's not just about the fact that, all right, if you use a mobile phone, then automatically you have to accept surveillance capitalism. This is the assumption which she is there to challenge, and she has written a whole book to kind of dismantle that understanding. Now, as I talked about that metaphor regarding home, so this is what she writes: all creatures orient. Look at the poeticity of this sentence, the literary appeal of her prose style. All creatures orient to home. It is a point of origin from which every species sets its bearings. Without our bearings, there is no way to navigate unknown territory. Without our bearings, we are lost. So whatever our roots are, whatever our essence is, we need to have a very clear understanding of what that is as we set out into the future. So with this, we move on to the first part of the book, which is entitled The Foundation of Surveillance Capitalism. Now, in this section, in this part, there are 5 chapters, as I mentioned in front of it. And in this chapter, she talks about the establishment of this surveillance capitalism. And she has talked about Google, which was incorporated in 1998 by Stanford graduate students, Larry Page and Sergey Brin. And what they did was that with the help of these doors to the World Wide Web were opened, and before that we see that when they gave this free email service, Gmail, which was launched in 2004, so it was allowed, by default, they were allowed to look at this private correspondence, which used to be private correspondence. So they gave a free service, which was Gmail, and we used to, of course, send emails and messages, and they were able or allowed to snoop on it and to see what is being written in those emails. And then based on the data they gathered, they aimed advertising towards us. So this was Google's invention of targeted advertising, which paved the way to financial success. But it also laid the cornerstone of a far-reaching development. And what was it? The discovery and elaboration of surveillance capitalism. So that was the root of surveillance capitalism, ke jahan se uska ye aagaaz ho raha hai. And then there is a lot in the book. Honestly, when I read it again for this book talk, I prepared in the first cycle, I prepared 48 pages of Microsoft Word document that I thought would be important from the book, from the old book. And then I limited it to, 20 pages, and then 48 slides of PowerPoint, and finally just 16, 17 slides. So I think that every single sentence of the book is so important. So since now I'm only giving you an introduction to the book, so I'm skipping everything. I'm just giving you a flavor of what this book is about and how does it progress, so that all of you can read it on your own. Because I would say that this would be a national responsibility on us as Pakistanis to know about surveillance capitalism and to think about it and to develop our own opinion about it. Instead of just saying, ke, oh, aap hi dekh lenge. Is tarah ki baat ki bajaye, all of us must know what it is about. So this event is mentioned in 2002 when Google discovered, with the help of its search engine, that one morning, and that's how she writes about it, that they saw this kind of sudden explosion of the desire to know about one particular character, Carol Brady. Carol Brady's maiden name. So everybody was looking up for it. Who was this woman and what was her maiden name? Now, why did that happen? Because there was this sitcom which was aired on American television, and there was a particular episode in which her name was mentioned. And those who were watching, they immediately started looking for her, that who was she and what was her maiden name. Now, she mentions that Google discovered that there is a huge potential, and they can see this predictive pattern, that the time on which in a particular time zone that show was aired, at a particular point in time, these search queries came. And of course, they had access to all the data. So they discovered that a lot of data is coming to them, and a lot of surplus data is coming to them, and that probably they can put a price tag to it. Because remember, back then Google was not monetized. So they were thinking about their monetization plans, कि हम इससे पैसे किस तरह कमाएं. तो अब जब ये उनके पास ये सारा डेटा कलेक्ट होना शुरू हो गया, and they were able to find pattern in those data, so they realized that we are sitting over this kind of this सोने का पहाड़, we are sitting over it. And then they hired someone, later on Facebook hired a Google executive, and it went on the same pattern. So in this first part, she also talks about mutuality of interest between the fledgling. This is very important for us. Now, some of us, whenever we talk about certain security concerns, our friends, many of them who have a sort of liberal leaning, they would always say, well, you go into conspiracy theory. Now, here it is, Harvard professor writing about it, and she says that there was this early marriage, mutuality of interest between the fledgling surveillance capitalists and state intelligence agencies. Now, of course, NSA and CIA, American agencies, and the tenacity with which the corporation defended its new territories. So, since she's talking about the foundation of how it came into being, surveillance capitalism, so she talks about it. Now, with this we move on to the second part. And in the second part, she talks about the advance of surveillance capitalism. Now, first one, foundation, where she talks about Google primarily and also Facebook. She also talks about Apple. I think that she also touches upon Amazon. So these big companies which rely on this surplus data that they acquire. So then in part 2, and then finally we have part 3. So she talks about migration of surveillance capitalism from the online environment to the real world. Now they begin to realize that the data that they have on human beings, they can also somehow tweak their behavior. They can also make them do certain things. So from this virtual world, they started moving towards reality, and they realized that the data that we have, with the help of data, we can even nudge human behavior. We can even make them do certain things. So she talks about that, and she has given lots of examples. How many of you have ever played a game which was called Pokemon Go? It used to be a very popular game where people had to walk and they had to go to actual places. Now at the back of it, it was also connected with various businesses. And those businesses were also paying Google, and then these people would go to certain shops, and that game would ask them to buy a certain thing, and they would actually buy something and they would get scores in that game. I haven't ever played the game, but she talks about it. And she also talks about lots of other projects where this happened, where this virtual environment was able to kind of to make people do certain things. So the virtual world creating an impact on the real world. So in this section she talks about that. Now within this, because this is a very comprehensive book. So the text of it, the chapters are of 525 pages. So there are lots of details in it, and I would strongly recommend that all of you should have this book, a personal copy of the book, because there is a lot that I am leaving out, and I cannot even simply touch upon the events that she has mentioned in the book. So she also then moves on and she says that how this internet is no longer available in our smartphones and our laptops and computers, but now what we call the Internet of Things. That these products are appearing which have this technology inbuilt in them. That the technology itself has these sensors and everything. So there is also, I was able to create this list from the book. So she has talked about smart skin. So it's going to be a sort of a skin which will be internet enabled, which will collect data and will be sending data to these companies. So she talks about this sensor tape which you can apply onto a surface, onto the bookshelves, onto the shelves of a supermarket, and then it will be automatically collecting data from it. Everything will be smart. So she also talks about smart homes which snoop on you all the time. So she also talks about this mattress which collects all the data as you sleep, and then at the end of the day would be telling you how good your sleep was. But that's just one side of it. The other side is all that data will be sent back to those companies, and those companies will have enormous amassment of knowledge at their fingertips. And they also then have this in mind that with the help of all that data, we can change behavior of people. So she talks about behavioral modification at length in the book. She talks about digital totalitarianism. She called these, the owners of these companies, digital tyrants, that they do not consider themselves under the law, and how they subvert law and how they dispossess various laws which come, are being debated in a society. So she talks about smart toothbrushes, smart light bulbs, smart coffee mugs, smart ovens, smart juicers, and smart utensils said to improve your digestion. And then even a doll could detect when a child's face turns towards it. So look at everything. Walls would be automated. You must have read about it, what we call Internet of Things. So she talks about it. And finally, within this part, she also talks about, this is her sentence, your body is reimagined as a behaving object to be tracked and calculated for indexing and research. Your terminology, sir, from information management, from indexing and search. And all that data in the hands of these owners, these individuals, these private companies, and the absence of any law regulating what they are doing. And finally, one example from the same section, in which there are 5 chapters. She mentions this 2012. I remember reading about it in the press, that in 2012 Facebook researchers, they conducted an experiment without the knowledge of users. And in that experiment, what they did was they manipulated the social and informational content of voting related messages in the news feeds of nearly 61 million Facebook users. So this innocuous Facebook feed that all of us see on Facebook, it is not that innocuous after all. It is also being managed. Now artificial intelligence and these algorithms are manipulating, and Facebook has experimented with it, and this paper was published, and they revealed the results, and they said that, well, we can control behavior. Once again, that idea. So they shifted voting patterns in the US. And later on, we know about the case of Cambridge Analytica, how this British company was employed by Trump's campaign, and how Cambridge Analytica designed Trump's campaign based on data it had gathered from Facebook. Nothing came out of it, only the company was, I think, the company came to an end, but its executives, they went scot-free. There is a documentary on it. I think all of you must watch it. It's available on Netflix as well. It is called The Great Hack. I would strongly recommend, and I would request the chief librarian that we may even plan a screening of this documentary here at the library also. The Great Hack. All of you should watch it, because this is this zeitgeist of our times. We must be familiar with what is going on, and even students of humanities under the ambit of digital humanities, we must try to know what's going on. Now with this we go to the final part of the book, which is entitled Instrumentarian Power for a Third Modernity. And this is, as I mentioned earlier on, this is a term that she has coined, instrumentarian power, and she also then explains that this is based on the data that we have, but then that data is utilized for someone's benefit, because that data is then sold out to third parties. अभी आपने ये WhatsApp की controversy आपको पता चली होगी, काफ़ी हमारे यहाँ ये recently आया, तो वो WhatsApp ने वो policy change करके यही कहा कि जो इधर से हम data gather करेंगे, वो data जो है वो हम बेचेंगे third parties, और उसी के ऊपर ये globe world over एक response जो है वो आया और एक निज़ामत बनी और लोगों ने और बहुत सी apps जो हैं वो install की. So यहाँ पे क्या वो कहती है कि पहले migration क्या हुई? The first was the migration from the virtual to the, so first of all it went virtual, then from virtual it went to the real world, up from the real world to the social world. कि अब जो उनकी quotes उसने share की हैं इन companies के मालिकों की, और जो उनके कुछ ऐसे इक़दामात हैं उनके बारे में उसने बताया है, और वो बताने के बाद वो ये कह रही है कि अब जो है ये चीज़ इस तरह से चल रही है कि वो ये देख रहे हैं कि हमने बिहेवियर्स भी मॉडिफाई करने हैं पूरी सोसाइटीज़ के, और फिर चाइना की एग्जांपल भी उसने इसी के अंदर जो है वो दी है. तो अब उसका नुक्ता नज़र क्या है? तो एक बात जो यहाँ पे मैंने ये कोट की है, यहाँ पे उसकी लिखी है, तो कह रही है द फ्रीडम ऑफ विल, कि आप इंसानों से फ्रीडम ही ले लें, उनकी विल भी ना हो और उनको पता भी ना हो न्यूज़ ये फेसबुक की फीड के जरिए, और इतना तमाम डेटा एक ही जगह पे अमैस हो जाए, तमाम तर लर्निंग जैसे पहले होता था डिवीजन ऑफ लेबर, तो इधर डिवीजन ऑफ नॉलेज करके वो तमाम डेटा इकट्ठा कर लिया, और उसके जरिए से आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस के जरिए से ऊपर जो बैठे हुए डेटा मुगल्स हैं वो तय करें कि माशरे को किस सिमत में जाना है, और उन लोगों को पता भी ना हो. जैसे फेसबुक ये एक्सपेरिमेंट कर चुका है कि वो लोगों के मूड क्रिएट कर सकता है, खुशी के और गमी के, थ्रू फेसबुक फीड. तो कितना ये सब जब इकट्ठा होगा तो किस तरफ को ये फ्यूचर जा रहा है, तो उसकी कंसर्न क्या है? द फ्रीडम ऑफ विल is the existential bone structure that carries the moral flesh. Look at the power of this language. The moral flesh of every promise and my insistence on its integrity is not an indulgence in nostalgia. जैसे कुछ लोग कहते हैं वो जी टेक्नोलॉजी ने तो आना ही है, ये पुराने दौर के ख्वाब देखने छोड़ दें, तो अब तो आपको एंगेज करना ही पड़ेगा. तो ये सिर्फ वो एक नॉस्टैल्जिया नहीं है, or a random privileging of the pre-digital human story as somehow more truly human. This is the only kind of freedom that we can guarantee ourselves, this freedom of will, no matter the weight of entropy or inertia, irrespective of the forces and fears that attempt to collapse time into an eternity of shadow boxing now and now and now. So it's a very deeply revolutionary book. As I move towards a close, I think only a couple of slides are left, you will realize how revolutionary this text is. So, if you are familiar with Marxism, you would have heard of the term false consciousness. So she says false consciousness is no longer produced by the hidden facts of class and their relation to production, but rather by the hidden facts of instrumentarian power's command over the division of learning in society as it usurps the rights to answer the essential questions. And this is a phrase that she keeps on repeating, these questions throughout the book. So she has sprinkled these phrases again and again to remind us what's the purpose of the book. Who knows? First of all, we don't know what's going on. And talk about the third world, a country like Pakistan. Talk about the first world, and even they don't know what's going on. And how is that data being utilized by these private companies? Who decides? And then Who decides? Who decides? Whether it is the state, whether it is these companies. So that is the problem. And then once again, this part that the NSA, Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, told Congress, now imagine a future where all these objects will also be smart objects. They would constantly be gathering data on us, and who would we be? These objects, these moving objects. And this data will be collected when we'll have wearable technologies, when we'll be, our even clothes will be sending data. Now in that environment, this Director of Intelligence Services says that we might use the Internet, of course it's called the Internet of Things. So Internet of Things for identification, surveillance, monitoring, location tracking, and targeting for recruitment. Recruitment from other countries as well. Recruitment from Pakistani universities as well. There is an excellent book in our library called The Spy School. You can read it. It's written by a Pulitzer-winning journalist, how higher education is used for espionage. It's an excellent book. It's available in our library. And to gain access to networks and to user credentials. Now, one final example before I conclude, and this comes from China. Of course, how can we leave out China? So there is this Sesame credit system in China. What it does is that it can offer you credit, but based on your credit scoring, and that credit scoring also comes कि आपके दोस्त कितने अमीर हैं, आपके पास गाड़ी कौन सी है, आप किधर मूव कर रहे हैं, किस जगह आप गए, because everything will be connected. तो अब उसके नतीजे में वो जो अपनी क्रेडिट स्कोरिंग इंप्रूव करना चाह रहे हैं, हमारे यहाँ भी ऐसे दोस्त हुआ करते हैं जिनको हम कहते हैं कि जो मतलबी दोस्त होते हैं, तो अब वो क्या, वो नच कर रहा होगा एक बिहेवियरल पैटर्न में, वो लिखता है कि क्रेडिट स्कोरिंग इंप्रूव करने के लिए वो लोग देख रहे होंगे कि किन दोस्तों से जान छुड़ानी है, including shedding friends with low scores and bulking up on high scoring individuals who some believe can boost one's own rank. तो वो ऑटोमेटिकली आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस के जरिए ये सब डेटा कलेक्ट हो रहा होगा और उसकी बुनियाद पे वो कंपनियां तय करेंगी कि आपको कितना जो है वो क्रेडिट देना है. Now the conclusion of this book is called A Coup from Above. Of course what she says is कि ये हमें पता ही नहीं चला कि हमारे माशरे को किस तरह से आके जकड़ लिया है इन कंपनीज ने, और इट इज अ कू फ्रॉम अबव. और जिस तरह से मैंने बात की थी, होम का मेटाफर वो इस्तेमाल करती है, तो यहाँ पे आप देखें कि कितना खूबसूरत उसने ये लिखा और कहा, होम इज आवर स्कूल ऑफ इंटिमेसी वेयर वी फर्स्ट लर्न टू बी ह्यूमन. Its corners and nooks conceal the sweetness of solitude. Its rooms frame our experience of relationship. Its shelter, stability, and security work to concentrate our unique inner sense of self, an identity that imbues our daydreams and night dreams forever. Forever. Its hiding places, closets, chests, drawers, locks, and keys satisfy our need for mystery and independence. Doors locked, closed, half shut, wide open, trigger our sense of wonder, safety, possibility, and adventure. According to Big Others architects, because that's also a term that she uses for them, उनके जो architects हैं वो क्या कहते हैं? These walls must come down. There can be no refuge. Everything will be monitored. So with this, and the second last slide, where she talks about tyranny. Because earlier on she talks about digital totalitarianism, कि इनकी जो desire है वो ये कि हर चीज को हमने समेट लेना है. Everything will be connected with the internet and things, not just human beings. तो वो कहती है कि ये जो tyrants हैं, ये डिस्कनेक्टेड होते हैं, इनके सीनों में दिल नहीं होता. एक टर्म वो इस्तेमाल करती है, रैडिकल इंडिफरेंस. दे आर इंडिफरेंट, उनको परवाह ही नहीं है कि इंसान कैसे सोचते हैं. तो कहती है, द टायरेंट रूल्स इन अकॉर्डेंस विद हिज ओन विल एंड इंटरेस्ट. the ruler who rules one against all, and the all he oppresses are all equal, namely equally powerless. Arendt, ये Hannah Arendt को इसने यहाँ पे कोट किया हुआ है, वो कहती है, notes the classical political theory regarded the tyrant as out of mankind altogether, कि इंसानियत ही उनमें नहीं होती, a wolf in human shape. ये देख लें कि ये हार्वर्ड की प्रोफेसर पूरी उस इकोनॉमिक रवायत से वाकिफ, वो इन कंपनी ओनर्स के बारे में और उनकी पूरी तारीख बयान करने के बाद इख्तिताम में वो क्या बात कहती है, और आखिर में जो वो मैनिफेस्टो दे रही है, मलिक साहब के साथ चाय पी नहीं है, हमको जाने जी जी, आखिरी स्टेटमेंट, we too can be the authors of many great and beautiful new facts that reclaim the digital future as humanity's home. वो home जो पीछे उसने define किया है, जो हमारी sense of mystery को protect करता है, refuge है, तो उसको हमें claim करना चाहिए, और वो कहती है हमें कहना चाहिए no more. Let this be our declaration. So with this I end my talk. Thank you very much. So thank you very much. Do we have any questions?